Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll please take your seats, we'll get the program started. I want to thank you for joining us here tonight for the Truman Medal for Economic Policy Award. My name is Alex Burden. I'm the Executive Director of the Truman Library Institute. I started at the Institute on November 1st, 2005, and my first event at the Truman Library was an event that some of you may remember, featuring Alan Greenspan. Quite the introduction to Truman programming and quite the introduction to this award ceremony. Very happy to still be here 19 years later. I've got a great job. President Truman's an important Kansas Cityan, and it's great to have good partners representing an overlooked aspect of President Truman's legacy. If you haven't been to the Truman Library recently, I encourage you to go see it. There's a new exhibit, Truman exhibit out there. It's 3 years old almost. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands to see how many people have traveled to Independence, but it's been called the best museum in the presidential library system and one of the greatest history museums in the country. It's really fantastic. Right now, if you visit, there's a special exhibit called Upset, which is about the 1948 whistle stop campaign. Truman defeats Dewey, go Truman. So very timely, given the fact that we're in another election cycle right now, and certainly there are things that you might not have thought would have happened in Truman's time, 1948, that are similar to today. But history repeats itself, and there's some important lessons to be learned. So I encourage you to go out and explore the exhibit, the special exhibit, attend our programs. Tonight we're meeting about, as I mentioned earlier, kind of a less well-known aspect of Truman's legacy, his economic legacy. President Truman was confronted by daunting economic challenges throughout his time in office. For example, in the months following World War II, Truman and his advisors faced a number of obstacles, including conversion of a wartime economy into a peacetime economic expansion, refinancing the national debt, and stimulating growth. In response, the Truman administration created a number of programs and institutions that resulted in the development of a new financial order, both nationally and internationally. In terms of domestic policy, the Truman administration's most significant and lasting contributions were the creation of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Monetary Accord of 1951. Internationally, President Truman and his advisors established the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. But one of Truman's greatest accomplishments is less well known. Some people say it's not an economic policy, but I'm talking about the Marshall Plan and numerous other significant, impactful post-World War II aid programs. During this pivotal moment in world history, President Truman and his administration worked with Congress in a bipartisan fashion, imagine that, on a series of programs that provided financial support, technical aid and advice, and other forms of monetary assistance to countries that were in ruins following World War II. A few examples you may or may not be familiar with: the Truman Doctrine, $400 million to support the economies and militaries of Greece and Turkey; the Marshall Plan, $13 billion in economic assistance to help rebuild Western European countries. The U.S. also provided $6 billion in grants and credits to Asian countries during the Truman administration, and another $500 million to aid countries in the Middle East. Combined, we're talking about $20 million. Now, I'm not an economist, so don't hold me to this number, but that's around $150 billion or more in today's dollars. And it wasn't just money. Massive aid delivery infrastructure and support services were established to maximize the impact of these relief funds. And economic policy changes were required, such as removing or reducing interstate trade barriers, revising or eliminating regulations, modernizing industry, increasing productivity, to name just a few. Truman was a very busy president during his 8 years. It wasn't just ending the war against the Japanese and the Berlin airlift and recognition of Israel, those kind of high history moments that we're all familiar with, but there was a lot of domestic improvements and policy changes he made. Thank you for entertaining my plug about Truman and my kind of wandering off into history. It is important, and it is the purpose of this event and the founding of this event, and I learned a little bit more from Stan Mengel tonight about how this event was created almost 20 years ago, and Tom Hoenig's involvement with that creation, along with Tom McDonald and Mike Devine, the former library director. So the Truman Medal for Economic Policy was created in 2005 to honor and celebrate the significant impact our hometown president, Harry Truman, had on the American economic system by recognizing individuals who have made extraordinary contributions to the formation of economic policy, such as our honoree tonight. This ceremony is organized through a partnership between the Truman Library Institute, the UMKC Bloch School of Management, represented by Dean Brian Clace. Brian, thank you. The Economic Club of Kansas City, represented by its president and executive director, Amy Holly Rose. Amy, thank you for your contributions to tonight's event. And also want to thank the sponsors, including 2 platinum sponsors, the Economic Club of Kansas City and Paul Thompson and Country Club Bank, as well as several gold level sponsors, including Farrell Capital, James E. and Elizabeth J. Farrell, the Ewing, Marion Kauffman Foundation, and the Sunderland Foundation. Additional thanks to J.E. Dunn Construction Company and the Ewing, Marion Kauffman Foundation for generously endowing this award in 2005. These and other sponsors are noted in your program. Now I have the honor of introducing Esther George, former President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Esther will be introducing and presenting the 2024 Truman Medal for Economic Policy Award to our and her very good friend, Tom Hoenig. Esther.
Well, good evening to all of you, and let me just say, it would be an understatement to say this is an honor for me to be able to introduce the 2024 recipient of the Truman Medal for Economic Policy, Thomas Hoenig. And I would just add to Alex's comments about the nature of this award, because it does recognize exceptional economic policy contributions, and I think also reflects the wisdom of President Harry Truman when he created the Council of Economic Advisors. It was a group whose adjacency to the United States president, I think, served 2 very important functions. One, of course, was to understand the importance of the economy to the citizens of this nation by having a group that would focus on these issues. And of course, the very nature of putting a group like that together meant there would be multiple views that would come together to inform the economic and policy processes that the White House was involved in. Let me start by saying something I think many of you know about Tom Hoenig. He, of course, is popularly recognized for offering a dissenting view while serving on the FOMC, which, of course, reflected the courage to express an independent view, and one that he saw as required of his duty to the public, not to a committee, not to a chairman of a committee. And that, of course, earned him a lot of attention, and it earned him several monikers. Tom, I went back to look at some of these from the archives. Bloomberg Businessweek referred to him as the Prairie Populist. And Time Magazine, by our very own David Von Draley, wrote, "The man who said no to easy money." And more recently, of course, he was featured in a book by Chris Leonard. That being said, though, I think the highlight reel of Tom Hoenig's career contributions go much deeper than that. Whether it was over the 38 years that he served at the Kansas City Fed, 20 of those of which he was the bank's president, whether it was his time at the FDIC serving as the vice chairman, or his current position as a distinguished senior fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Across those, you will find that he is someone who understands that short-run decisions can be costly, that good intentions are not enough to secure economic stability, and that long-run thinking is essential to the American public's well-being and prosperity. I've known Tom Hoenig for more than 40 years, and I will tell you that much of his career at the Fed was what I would call nose to the grindstone. High-impact work, for sure, in areas from monetary policy. He was heavily engaged in bank supervision and payments. And his influence as a leader strengthened the regional structure of the central bank, and particularly the Kansas City Fed. He insisted on performance excellence in delivering the Federal Reserve's mission. He invested in the development of talent that could execute on that mission, and he oversaw the construction of a modern facility that would house the Kansas City Fed's operations, and to this day have positioned it well to deliver a 21st century workplace and services on behalf of the public. I also want to say something about Tom's contributions to this community, because those too have been notable. He served on the board of the Kauffman Foundation, and as Alex mentioned, he was instrumental in chartering the Economic Club of Kansas City because he believed the economic insights of world-class speakers from around the globe that he was able to enjoy as a Fed official could benefit this region's and this city's business leaders too. Tom has been a tireless champion of Kansas City and the surrounding region. And so just as the Truman Medal for Economic Policy has been awarded to some of our nation's finest leaders and policymakers, we recognize tonight another such leader, and this time from our own community. Please join me as we welcome Tom to the podium to receive the 2024 Truman Medal for Economic Policy.
Well, I'm almost speechless. Thank you so much, Esther, for that very generous introduction. Before I get started, though, I want to make an observation, and that is no matter how sure you are of the future, you have to understand it can change on you. Because I was told without any doubt that tonight would be no conflicts and the Chiefs would not be playing tonight. And they were right. Now, I am dressed in blue, knowing that I have to salvage some of the evening here. Let me also thank the Truman Library, the Economic Club of Kansas City, and the Bloch School of Business for awarding me this Truman Medal, which, as you said, recognizes President Truman's role in creating the Council of Economic Advisors, which in advising the president also advises the nation on very important matters. And as also was noted, President Truman had a rather tense relationship with the Federal Reserve over matters that are very similar to today when World War II ended. But because he and the Fed and the Congress were able to find common ground and were willing to compromise, we were able to solve many of those problems. And over his term and beyond, we were able to work together. And I think that's something we should keep in mind as I make my remarks this evening. I also want to recognize, as others have, that previous recipients of this medal were of the highest integrity, Paul Volcker, for example. And so I accept this medal with the greatest humility, and thank you. It is certainly an honor that I appreciate. Now, there are many people who made this medal possible for me. It wasn't just me, I realize that, and I can't thank them all here tonight. But I do want to acknowledge some of them who've been so important to me. And I want to start with my family who are here, my sons Michael and Alex, their wives Margarita and Jen, and my grandchildren, James, Nora, Alejandro, and Anna. Anna's special. They're so good to be here with me tonight, but I particularly want to thank my wife, who actually stood next to me during many policy encounters, I'll call them, and did not run when the tomatoes began to be thrown. So thank you, Sarah, very much for being part of it, of my success in receiving this medal. I again want to thank Esther. I again want to thank Esther, but not just for the wonderful, gracious comments, but because as president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, she also encountered her own policy challenges. and dealt with them as well as anyone could, including me. And she took the bank to the next level of performance, which I could not reach. So thank you so much, Esther. And I want to thank Diane Rayleigh, who was Chief of Staff both for Esther and for me, and whose strategic insights and her organizational and operational skills led the bank through a number of encounters herself and led the bank to success. Thank you, Diane, for all you did over our careers. Now, not too much longer, but I want to acknowledge, when I left the Federal Reserve and I went to the FDIC as vice chairman, I was very fortunate to be able to recruit some of the finest executives of the FDIC on a rotating basis to serve as deputy to the vice chairman's office. And without their work and support, this was a period after the great financial crisis when everything in banking was in turmoil. I could not have done that job. I want you to know that. And so I want to mention them by name so that if you talk to them this evening, you know their contributions. And I want to start with Chuck Morris, who actually came with me from the Fed. Then Diane Ellis. Following her was Kathy Kausler, who could not be here. She's ill. Carl Reitz, Bobby Bean, Michael Spencer, and covering all of them, Michelle Heller, who were part of that office and made it very successful. And without them, I wouldn't be standing here as well. So thank you all very much. Now, Chris Leonard could not be here tonight. He's ill, but I still want to recognize him because he wrote the book, The Lords of Easy Money, which I would just say presented the post-financial crisis period of policy from a different perspective, mine. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much, Chris, if you're watching. So I want to also tell you that the Economic Club of Kansas City, its program theme is resilience. And what a well-chosen theme. For resilience is absolutely essential to any institution or any country's long-run success. And I'm about the long run. And in the spirit of Harry Truman, I entitled my remarks this evening, Resilience. It's a choice. It's not an entitlement. You have to make hard choices. Resilience is absolutely essential if you're going to have a successful economy, if you're going to be able to withstand shocks and still go forward. And resilience, the framework of, requires that you have clear goals for your country, for yourselves. It requires that you have a regimen that takes you towards those goals, and requires the discipline to stay with that regimen. I have to tell you that my experience over the many years in policy is that we don't always do that as policymakers, and that includes me. When a crisis or an immediate problem surfaces, you want a quick solution, and you'll use whatever means you think is necessary to find that solution, to shorten the pain of the crisis. But one of the difficulties is once you do that, you think it's so successful, you want to keep it in place. And the long-run effects on our economy and on our public, the unintended effects can be very uneven across the public, and we have to be mindful of that. I recently read an article in the Wall Street Journal which described in a survey the extent, the large majority of people who still cherish the American dream, a home, a job, a family, and a decent retirement. And what the article also pointed out is more of them feel that that is beyond their grasp today. And the data, unfortunately, tends to support that. A survey that the Federal Reserve did showed that 10% of households control nearly 70% of household wealth. And that's up from 60% in 1989. But just as importantly, it showed that the bottom 50% of households controlled only 2.5%. And so the journal itself concluded that we've come to a time where the well-off, the asset holders, are moving away from everyone else. And that's unfortunate. Now, there are many causes to this. There's not one person or one thing or one group to blame. There's a combination of things, but the two I want to talk about is the things I've been involved in, and that's the fiscal and monetary policy, while we tried to do everything to make sure we did not have a crisis, we tended to go too far with the unfortunate effects to the public. For example, in monetary policy, we got involved in the massive creation of dollars, new money. And we deliberately suppressed interest rates for an extended period of time. But as it went on over time, it benefited the debtor and the speculator and penalized the saver. Or our Congress, who insists on spending more money than we have in revenue, borrowing the difference. Pushing, should I say, bequeathing to the next generation the burden of that debt. Now, in 2010, the Federal Reserve, I was a part of it, but the Federal Reserve engaged in massive printing of money, quantitative easing, or QE as it's like to be called. And they did it for a good purpose, I understand, but they left it in place for an extended period of time. And as they did that, we also created the opportunity for greater inflation. Because one of the things Congress did, it gave to the Federal Reserve System the power to create money as it deemed necessary. It gave them the power, the discretion to decide when it should print that money as it deemed possible. Now, in the short run, if you have a crisis, it's a very important tool. It's a very useful tool. Because it can, when you have a crisis, people freeze up, they hoard their money, they withdraw, they become less aggressive. And so putting that money in provides the liquidity, provides the ability to restart the economy and shorten a crisis moment. All wonderful. But if you think it does that well for the short run and you think it can last forever, then you start inviting serious unintended consequences. Let's just take the balance sheet of the Fed. Before the first financial crisis in 2007, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was $900 billion. Over the next 2 decades, as we went through the great financial crisis and then COVID, that balance sheet went to $9 trillion. Because if a little bit would help, a lot must help a lot more. Now, some of the effects of that, of course, was that we began to see asset inflation, as intended, to create wealth. But of course, you only benefit if you hold the assets. And the wealthiest hold the most assets. So they won, while real wages and productivity remain relatively dormant for all that stimulus. So the effect, in a sense, was to redistribute wealth even further than it was. Unfortunately so. Unnecessarily so, perhaps. Now, when they pushed this money into the economy and they kept interest rates low, they also had the effect of multiplying that up through leverage, which made a more fragile economy. So we had to deal with that. Now, over time, as we learned in 2022, the asset inflation seeped into consumer price inflation that affected a much broader coverage of the American people and reaped more adverse effects on more people. And that caused, maybe even forced the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates and to pause quantitative easing. And then over the next 2 years, the last 2 years, for example, having done that, we were able to finally bring inflation down from an understated 9% that was stealing from the people's purchasing power, back down to now 2.5% to 3%. Not where it should be, but much improved. And because of this fiscal stimulus that is still in play, we have the economy still growing at 3%. We're very fortunate that way. We have unemployment still at 4.1%. We're very fortunate that way. And so we should celebrate that. And I'm very pleased with that. But I'm not satisfied with that. Because now is the opportunity for policymakers of the United States, whether it's in Congress or in the Federal Reserve, to look past the moment, this moment of celebration, if you will, for this lower interest rate, and over the horizon to what lies ahead. And what lies ahead is a crossroads which I think has many difficult decisions that I think are important. For one thing that hasn't been addressed, that hasn't been taken care of, is the national debt and the growth in the national debt that continues unabated, even though inflation is coming down, as the Congress continues to spend more than it takes in revenue. I think that is the greatest challenge we have. And think about it for a moment. How much debt? In 2010, when the Federal Reserve began quantitative easing, the national debt was around $11 to $12 trillion. Today, it exceeds $35 trillion. And what really bothers me is we talk about trillions as if they were peanuts. I mean, people they're not shocked. And we all should be shocked when we think about that kind of growth in our debt. Now, with that, of course, has come further asset inflation. But what about the future? If we stay on this line, well, let's use Congress's own estimate that the Congressional Budget Office provided to us. It tells us if we stay with current laws, not what's being promised in campaigns, but in current laws and current taxes, that over the next decade, that the national debt will be over $50 trillion. Over $50 trillion. That the interest on the debt, which is now $1 trillion and larger than our national defense budget, will grow even larger than the $1 trillion on a consistent basis. That the debt to national income, which is now 120%, will become greater than 120%. But here's the most important thing. It projects that our real growth rate, the creation of wealth for the for the entire population, will slow from an average, a modest average actually, of 2.2% to less than 1.8%. And if you think of that in terms of real wealth growth for the American people, it means we are giving up, by allowing our economy to slow to that level, we are giving up more than $1 trillion over the next decade for future generations. That's what we are sacrificing by staying on the path we are. Now, the question is, can we change that path? Yes. Are we willing to do so? We better find out, and we better make some hard choices. Or we can do it if Congress and the Fed agree to, and the administration. First of all, the Congress has to place its houses in order. A dysfunctional Congress cannot work to the benefit of the American people. It has to bring itself to order. And it has to decide that it is going to better balance our national budget. I don't mean surplus, I mean better balance it than where it is today. And in doing that, yes, it's going to have to either cut spending, almost a must, or raise taxes, probably, or something in the middle through compromise, study, and decision-making. It can't stand back. Now, people say, Tom, that can't be done. Well, let me go back to what Alex said. When World War II ended, we had debt to our national income of 120%, where it is today. And there was conflict between the Fed and the White House and the Congress, but they put the nation first. They put the nation first. And as a result of that, we're able to come to compromise, and over the term of Truman and on beyond that, the debt to our national income declined from 120% to less than 40%. Now, that's not the only case. In the mid-90s, when the national debt started to rise again, a Republican Congress and a Democratic administration, who didn't necessarily like one another, put the country first. And over that period, passed budgets that reduced the debt to national income systematically for 4 years, and in the fourth year actually ran a surplus. But the most important thing I can tell you about what they accomplished was in each of those years, the growth in our real national income was 4% or greater. An incredible growth rate in a period where you're managing your budget responsibly. Labor won, real wages went up. Capital won, return on capital was a decent return. The American people won. That's the kind of thing it takes. So that's number one. Number two, the Federal Reserve, and I say this, I really love the Federal Reserve, but the Federal Reserve has to regain its primary mission. Through QE, it has intertwined fiscal and monetary policy. It has to retire QE as a mainstream policy tool that it uses, and use it only in those exceptional circumstances that's required in a crisis, but not as an ongoing tool, not growing its balance sheet to fund the debt. The mandate of the Federal Reserve is very straightforward: to promote, first of all, maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. That's its mandate. And that mandate is not inconsistent, the different parts of that. If you think of the long run, stable prices and maximum employment go together, and so do moderate long-term interest rates. But it takes the will to do that. And what is not in its mandate, and where I have major differences with the Federal Reserve, it's not there to fund the national debt. It's not there to be the market maker for treasuries. That's the Treasury's job, the Congress's job, and the private sector. That's what bond vigilantes are for. The Federal Reserve's job is to provide enough money so that our economy can grow at 3 to 4% on an annual basis in real terms, as it did in the mid-90s, as it was balancing its budget. That's the goal. And that's what we can achieve if we decide to do so, if our leadership decides to do so, and if we, the people, support that leadership. And that's a big, big requirement on our part, because too often we, the people, don't support efforts to bring our budget into balance and our policy into balance as well for the American people. I'm going to close with, I hope you forgive me, a Greek proverb that I've known for some time, and which, in a sense, demonstrates how long these problems have been going on. But it's a very good proverb. It says, societies grow great when their leaders plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit in. If our leaders roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty, and we, the people, support them, then I'm very confident we will have a strong economy. And I'm very confident we will have a resilient economy for the next generation. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what resilience is really all about. Thank you all very much for this wonderful honor and for this Truman Medal. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I feel guilty that I talked so long that you had to stand up to stretch, so. Amy asked if I would be willing to take questions. I know there's a ball game going on, but I'm happy to take questions. In fact, I'm dressed for it, but I'm happy to take questions from the audience if we have any.
Thank you so much, Tom. We have a microphone right over here, and I'll also encourage the couple hundred people who are watching online that they can type them in the chat, and I will ask those as well.
All right. Any questions? Anyone? Nope. That first question is always the toughest. Here we go. Well, here's a familiar face.
I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Mr. Ferguson a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So, and actually, I don't want this to be a political question. I guess I want this to be
Everything's political.
a projection, or at least your opinion about things. You talked about it, and I think what you said, I agree with it 100%. Assuming, which is not an unrealistic assumption, that doesn't happen. Because I don't, I would like to think that there's the will, but there's a lot of conflagration out there between people. What is the economic outcome for the average person if the debt keeps going up? I'm curious as to what's the worst case scenario?
Well, there are many you can pick, but let's just. What I think most likely would happen is that the U.S. economy would continue to print money, because what happens if the Fed actually says no, which is what they should do, to the Congress, then that's going to put upward pressure on interest rates, because the only people who can lend to them are people that hold dollars, and that's savers. And if the Fed says we're not going to print the money, that means it has to come to the savers. Interest rates have to come in so that the government can have it rather than the private sector. So that's one of the things that happens. And then over time, if that occurs, you have inflation. That'll push even more pressure on the economy and higher interest rates. Then the growth rate of the economy will slow, as the Congressional Budget Office actually anticipates. And that means there is less money, real wealth, to go around. So the pie doesn't grow as much. That means there's more conflict over the pie, because asset holders will be the winner with inflation, wage earners will fight for their share, and you will have more conflict, more social unrest, and I think a very difficult period. And if you continue it on, everyone thinks the dollar, and the dollar is going to remain the world's reserve currency for some time to come. But it's not a right. It's not an entitlement. It's something we earn through our great productivity and our industrial, shall we say, success. And so if we give that up, over time we will give up the benefit of being the world's. Now I'm talking more than a generation ahead, perhaps, but I call it slow death by 1,000 cuts. Now, the other thing that can happen is we have an inflationary outbreak of serious consequences, not hyperinflation necessarily, but like before, 14% when Paul Volcker was the chair of the Fed. And the Fed says enough, and we have a terrible recession, we have a crisis, people suffer a great deal, but we then say, let's pick ourselves up and go forward and learn from this mistake and hopefully not repeat it soon. And I don't want a crisis, no one does. But I do want us to survive and remain the strongest, best economy and country in the world. And we shouldn't take it for granted. That's my point. So we are not safe just by sitting here. We have to do something. We have to make decisions, and we have to insist that our leaders make decisions for the long run.
Thank you for those comments. It's sobering, but
yes, it is. It is. People have said, Tom, you're the doom and gloomer, and I accept it reluctantly, but I accept it.
Thank you.
I'm going to take you at your word when you said everything's political. So I'm going to ask you a question that
Sure.
just is on my mind, and I'm sure it's been announced. That one of the major candidates said that he would like to have more influence over the Fed, and his intuition might be more of value than the data that the Fed currently uses to make its decisions. Would you like to comment on that statement?
Well, of course not. But you asked me the question, now you're going to get the long answer, and that is, I of course think the Fed needs to be accountable. And I've argued for some time that it should have the ability to create money as it does, but not without some, shall we say, boundaries. And I've argued for some time that in a crisis, the Fed should have the authority to create money to address that crisis for up to 6 months. That's an arbitrary number, but it's a long enough period that you can deal with a crisis. And if it wants to continue with its extreme policies, like quantitative easing beyond that period, it has to get congressional and administrative approval to do that. Now, that doesn't mean, that they won't get it. It means that they have to make their case. Now, it's only for the extreme. So if they wanted to continue QE, okay, here it is. We're going to continue it, Congress and the administration. Now, does that mean you solve the problem? Not necessarily. But then, and here's my but. But then I know who to blame. My representative, my senator, because only they can pass that law outside of the boundaries that are set for them. That's how I would address that issue.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Hi. Good. Yeah, hi. So here we're celebrating the Truman Medal for Economic Policy, and there are quite a few people, 9 others, who have received this award before. If you were to be able to get in a room with all of them, all of the past recipients of the Truman Medal for Economic Policy, what would you ask to your colleagues in that circle? And then what do you think that they would ask to you?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I would ask them, how are we going to solve this problem? And I hope they have wonderful ideas about it. And I would ask them for specifics. How quickly do you, for example, how firm should the Federal Reserve be over the next 24 months on insisting that it is not going to monetize the growing debt? How do you do that? How do you communicate it? Now, Paul Volcker did communicate that. He said, we are not going to accommodate you. And he wasn't exactly a popular person for doing that. So I would ask them that specific. And then, how would you deal, if they don't, how do you think this is going to play out? And how do we educate the public? Because I've told people this before. Your Congress usually does do what you want. And I've spoken across the country. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I've told people, I've spoken to investment clubs of retired groups, and they say, oh, the debt, you're right, Tom, how are we going to do it? I'm going to say, well, we need to raise the retirement age to at least 70. It doesn't get received like I'd hoped.
People aren't super excited about that.
I tell the agriculture community, they say, how are we going to, I said, well, subsidies are pretty expensive, no. So we have, what this group would do, and they are the group that could do it, I think, is educate, and that is, we need shared sacrifice. We need a leadership who says to the people, this is what we have to do. We're putting everything on the table. We don't care about the lobbyists. They're going to stay out of the room. We want to come to a, and this has been done. Bowles-Simpson, not too many years ago. So it can be done. And this group that you've asked me about are certainly people who could do it. So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much for this wonderful evening. Thank you.